Hi, boys and girls. I am ready today. We are going to read chapter 10, and it is called An Aimless Night. And it starts out with a picture of Keith. At first, Ralph's scheme worked. Keith delivered the promised bacon, toast, and jelly. The mice ate sparingly and laid aside the leftovers against the day that Keith must leave the hotel. Ralph's mother continued to worry about tipping the room service. I want to do the right thing, she insisted. There must be some way that we can manage a tip. The mice dared not leave the nest to search for small coins that might have rolled under beds and dressers. It was late in the afternoon when Ralph heard Keith and his parents returning to their rooms. Very quietly, so that his toenails did not make a scrabbling sound on the woodwork, he slipped to the knothole and peeped out in time to see Keith flop down on the bed. Do I have to go down to the dining room for dinner? Keith asked his mother and father. I'm not hungry. Uh-oh, thought Ralph. There goes dinner. I told you not to eat that whole bag of peanuts so close to dinner time, said his father. I didn't eat all of it, said Keith. That's good, thought Ralph. At least there will be peanuts for dinner. You'll feel better after you get washed up for dinner, said Mrs. Gridley. Hurry along now. When his parents had gone into room 216, Ralph noticed that Keith seemed to drag himself off the bed. He walked to the wash basin, turned on the cold water, moistened his fingers, and wiped them over his face. Then he turned off the water, gave the middle of his face a swipe with the towel, which he returned to the towel rack in such a way that it immediately fell on the floor. Keith did not pick it up, but there was nothing unusual about this. Boys rarely picked up towels. What was unusual was that Keith returned to the bed where he sat down and stared at the wall. He did not play with his cars, nor did he eat the rest of his peanuts. He just sat there. Ralph stuck his head out of the knothole. Anything wrong? He asked. Oh, hi, answered Keith listlessly. I feel sort of awful. Say, that's too bad. Ralph ventured a little further out of the knothole. I know what you mean. My insides. Think you'll make it to dinner? Asked Ralph. Oh, I guess so. There was no enthusiasm in Keith's voice, though. Anything I can bring you? Whatever's handy, said Ralph, who hesitated to place an order when he could see that Keith did not feel like going to dinner at all. We are sort of depending on you. The housekeeper found all those sheets that I chewed through to get out of the hamper, and I understand she got pretty excited about mice. We are lying low until the whole thing blows over. A smile flickered across Keith's face. Don't worry, I won't let you down. I saved you some peanuts. I thought they might be handy for storing. Gee, thanks, said Ralph. Keith got slowly off the bed and poked the peanuts one by one through the knothole. When he had finished, Ralph popped out again and said, Thanks a lot. Keith smiled feebly and flopped down on the bed once more. Ralph went to work, moving the peanuts away from the knothole to make room for whatever dinner Keith brought. He felt that it would be fun to be surprised by the menu this time. It was something of a shock to find that dinner, which was stuffed through the knothole much earlier than Ralph expected, consisted of a couple pieces of broken soda crackers. Ralph poked his head out to see if more was coming, but Keith was getting into his pajamas. Aren't you going to bed pretty early? Asked Ralph, realizing he had not heard Keith's parents come in. I felt so awful that I couldn't eat, so they told me I'd better come up and go to bed. Keith tossed his shirt on the foot of the bed and pulled on his pajama top. When his head emerged, he said, I'm sorry about your dinner. It was the best I could do. All I had was a little soup. That's all right. Ralph was beginning to be concerned. If the boy could not eat, neither could the mice. Keith fell into the bed and Ralph ran off to report the news to his relatives. There's Keith. Oh dear, whatever shall we do? Cried Aunt Dorothy. Our very lives depend on him. The little cousins huddled together, big-eyed and frightened. Yes, what about us? asked Uncle Lester. "How are we going to manage if he doesn't bring us our meals? It isn't safe for us to go out pilfering when the housekeeper has declared war on mice." "I knew it was a mistake to depend on people," said Aunt Sissy. "We'll manage somehow. We always have." Ralph's mother was trying to be brave, but Ralph could see how worried she was. After all, he did bring us a supply of peanuts. We should be grateful for that. "He didn't bring many peanuts," Uncle Lester did not sound the least bit grateful. "The greedy fellow is probably ill from stuffing himself with nuts that he should have saved for us. Serves him right." "Now, Lester," fussed Ralph's mother, "the boy had a right to eat his own peanuts, but do I wish he hadn't been quite so hungry." Ralph returned to the knothole. Keith was lying in bed with his sports car in one hand. "How do you feel now?" asked Ralph. "Awful," answered Keith. Before Ralph could reply, footsteps in the hall warned him that Keith's parents were coming. He drew back inside the knothole where he could observe without being seen. Mrs. Gridley paused by her son's bed and laid her hand on his forehead. "He does feel a little warm," she remarked. "He'll probably be all right in the morning," said Mr. Gridley. "He just hiked too far in the sun this afternoon." "I hope so." The boy's mother sounded less certain. Mr. Gridley filled a glass in the wash basin and brought it to Keith. "Here, son, drink this." When Keith had drunk the water, he fell back on the pillow and closed his eyes. His parents went quietly into room 216. When it was good and dark, Ralph ventured through the knothole. He could hear Keith breathing deeply, and he knew that he was asleep. Since he had no one to talk to, he found his little crash helmet where it had been hidden behind the curtain, and after he had adjusted the rubber band under his chin, he climbed up to the windowsill to look out into the world beyond the hotel and to dream about the lost motorcycle. From his perch on the windowsill, Ralph saw that the parking lot held more cars than usual. This meant that the motel back on the highway was full, and travelers had followed the signs pointing to Mountain View Inn. He could hear the holiday weekend activities in the hall. People walking up and down, luggage being set with a thump on the floor, keys rattling in the locks. Gradually, as the night wore on, the hotel grew silent, more silent than usual, for now even the second-floor mice were quiet. There was no scurrying, scrabbling, or squeaking inside the walls. In the silence, Keith tossed in his sleep and mumbled something that sounded like motorcycle. In a moment, his mother slipped through the doorway, pulling her robe over her nightgown. Ralph hid behind the curtain, peeping out just enough to see what was going to happen. She laid her hand on her son's forehead and murmured, "Oh dear." Almost at once, she was joined by Keith's father, who was tying the belt on his bathrobe. "What's the trouble?" he asked. "Keith has a fever," answered the mother. "He's burning up." Ralph was shocked. The boy really was sick. It was not too many peanuts or too much hiking. The boy was really and truly sick. The father turned on the lamp on the bedside table, and he too laid his hand on the boy's forehead. Keith's eyes opened. "I'm so hot," he mumbled. "I want a drink." His mother pulled back a blanket while the father brought a glass of water and held it up to his son's head so he could drink part of it. Ralph watched anxiously, but this time he was not selfishly concerned about room service. He was concerned about Keith, the boy who had saved him from a terrible fate in the wastebasket and who had trusted him with his motorcycle. The boy who had forgiven him when he had lost that motorcycle and who had brought food not only for Ralph, but for his whole family. "We had better give him an aspirin to bring down his temperature," said Mrs. Gridley. Mr. Gridley started towards room 216, stopped and snapped his fingers as if he had just remembered something. "I took the last one back in Rock Springs, Wyoming," he said. "I had a headache from driving towards the sun all afternoon. I meant to buy some more when we stopped, but I didn't think of it again until now." I should have thought of it myself, said Mrs. Gridley. I knew we were almost out. Never mind, I'll get some. Mr. Gridley picked up the telephone, listened, shook it, listened again, and said, That's peculiar. The line seems to be dead. They must disconnect the switchboard at night, said the mother. But surely there's someone on duty at the desk downstairs. Every hotel has a night clerk. I'll go find out, said the father, and slipped out the door into the hall. I'm so hot, mumbled Keith. I'm so hot. His mother wrung out a washcloth in cold water and laid it on her son's forehead. You'll feel better as soon as we get you an aspirin, she whispered. The minutes dragged by. What's keeping him? Thought Ralph. Why doesn't he hurry? The old hotel snapped and creaked. Keith rolled and tossed, trying to find a cool spot on the pillow, and his mother wrung out the washcloth in more cold water. When's Dad coming? Asked Keith, his eyes bright and his cheeks flushed. In a minute, soothed his mother. He'll be back here in a minute. I wish he would hurry, thought Ralph. Still, the minutes dragged on. Finally, footsteps were heard in the hall, and Mr. Gridley returned to room 215. He's here with the aspirin, whispered Mrs. Gridley to Keith. At last, thought Ralph. I thought he would never come. Mr. Gridley shook his head. There isn't an aspirin to be found any place. He sounded thoroughly exasperated. First of all, the night clerk was sound asleep on the couch in the lobby. I had a dickens of a time waking him up, and when I finally did manage to, he couldn't find any aspirin anywhere. Oh, no, exclaimed the mother. Oh, no, echoed Ralph's thoughts. What about that little gift shop off the lobby? Asked Mrs. Gridley. It must sell aspirin. Locked up tight, and the clerk went home with the key, answered Mr. Gridley. Oh, dear. The night clerk was really very nice about it, said the father. He even came up and looked in the housekeeper's office. How far is the nearest drugstore? Here's a picture of the night clerk before he was woken up. "25 miles back on the main highway," answered the father, "and it closed at 10 o'clock and doesn't open until 9 in the morning." The mother held her watch under the lamp. "And it's almost 1 o'clock. It is hours until morning." She crossed the room to wring out the washcloth again. "What will we do?" "What can we do?" asked the father helplessly. "I even telephoned the doctor, but there has been a bad accident back on the highway and he can't come. The night clerk said he would telephone the milkman before he starts his rounds at 6 and ask him if he can bring some aspirin, but he won't get here until 7 or later. All we can do is wait." Keith tossed under the cold washcloth. "Mom, I think I'd like to go to sleep now," he muttered thickly. "I guess that is all that you can do," said his mother, and bent over to kiss his hot forehead before she turned out the light. Ralph did not even wait for the boy's parents to leave the room. As soon as the light was out, he leaped silently to the carpet, and by the time they had gone through the doorway into room 216, he had hidden his little crash helmet behind the curtain and was halfway through the knothole. Somewhere, someplace in that hotel, there must be an aspirin tablet, and Ralph was going to find it. He only wished he had the motorcycle so he could travel faster. Dun, dun, dun. Let's see. Chapter 11. The Search. "I have to go into the hotel," Ralph informed his relatives. "I've got to help the boy." "Oh, no, not into the hotel," cried Ralph's mother. "Not while the housekeeper is looking for mice. If you're seen, we'll all be in danger." "I'll be back before dawn," said Ralph staunchly. "I must go. Don't try to stop me." "See here, my boy, aren't you being a bit dramatic?" asked Uncle Lester. "Whatever do you have to go into the hotel for?" "To pilfer a pill," said Ralph. "An aspirin tablet." His answer was dramatic enough, even for Uncle Lester. His entire family stared at him in disbelief. Not an aspirin, not after his own father had been poisoned by one of the dreadful tablets. "An aspirin," Ralph's mother gasped. "No, Ralph, not that. Anything but that." "It's the only way." Ralph stood tall and brave. "The boy has a fever and he needs an aspirin. I'm going to find him one." "Oh, Ralph." His mother hid her face in her paws. "But Ralph," quivered Aunt Sissy, "remember your father. You can't carry an aspirin in your cheek pouches. It would poison you. How could you get it here? I'll find a way. Ralph was outwardly steadfast in his determination, but inside he wondered how he would manage to get an aspirin into room 215 if he did find one. Roll it, perhaps? Ralph, stay here, pleaded his mother. You're too young. Let Uncle Lester go. Well, now, let's talk this over, said Uncle Lester. I'm not too young, and I haven't a moment to lose, said Ralph, who was really frightened by what he was about to do, but also enjoyed the drama of the moment. Goodbye. I shall return before dawn. Ralph, promise me you'll be careful, pleaded his mother. Promise me you won't climb into the suitcase like your Aunt Adrian did. Ralph's Aunt Adrian had liked nice things and had climbed into a suitcase to examine a nylon stocking that someone had someone had closed the suitcase, and she had never been seen again. It was hoped that she had been carried away to a life of luxury. Promise me, Ralph, cried his mother, but her son was already on his way out the knothole. Ralph scurried across the carpet of room 215, flattened himself, and squeezed under the door. Once out in the hall, his courage ebbed. The aspirin tablet seemed a very small thing to find in such a vast place. It would be much easier to find the motorcycle. No, thought Ralph, I must not even think about the motorcycle. Ralph began to feel pretty small himself, much smaller than he had felt during his show of bravery back in the mouse nest. Down in the lobby, a clock struck 1. There was not a moment to lose. He ran to the next room, squeezed under the door, and searched under the bed and dresser while the 2 guests slept soundly. All he found was a bobby pin. He skipped room 211 because his enemy, the little terrier, was still there, and he ran on to room 209. A hurried search, frightened because of the loud and uneven snores that came from the beds, revealed nothing but a few pretzel crumbs, which Ralph did not have time to eat. On and on ran Ralph, down the hall, under doors, around under beds and dressers. There was not a single aspirin tablet to be found. In one of the rooms, he did see a penny that had rolled under a luggage rack, and remembered his mother's wish to leave a tip for room service. But tonight he had no time for pennies. He must press on and find an aspirin. A small doubt began to creep in Ralph's thoughts as he ran down the hall to the last room on the 2nd floor. Maybe there was no aspirin. Maybe he was risking his life and the lives of his family for nothing. But Ralph pushed the thought aside. He would not let himself be discouraged. If there was no aspirin on the 2nd floor, there had to be one someplace on the ground floor. Tonight, he was willing to brave the stairs to find it. He flattened himself and squeezed under the last door on the 2nd floor. There was nothing under either of the beds but the things Keith called dust mites. There was no sound but the rattle of the windows in the wind. Ralph started across the carpet towards the dresser when suddenly a light from the bedside table blinded him. He stopped, rooted to the carpet by fear, even though it was not likely that anyone was going to cut off his tail with a carving knife. He heard someone slip out of bed and utter a sound halfway between a squeal and a scream. Before Ralph knew what was happening, an ordinary drinking glass had been clapped down over him, and there he stood in a glass trap. By then, his eyes were adjusted to the light, and he found himself facing a pair of bare feet. Looking up, he saw that the feet belonged to a young woman in a pink nightgown. Mary Lou, wake up, she whispered to the young woman in the other bed. Look what I've caught. Huh, said Mary Lou, blinking and raising up on her elbows. Her hair was done up in pink rollers. Betty, are you out of your mind? It must be past 1 o'clock in the morning. Oh no, there's poor Ralph, stuck in a glass. The night was slipping by much too quickly for the trapped mouse. He was terrified and he was desperate. No one in his family had ever been trapped under a drinking glass before. Worst of all, he was failing Keith and endangering his family. Wake up, Mary Lou, and look, insisted Betty. I was getting up to stop the rattle in the window and caught a mouse. This news roused Mary Lou from bed, and the two young women knelt on the carpet to look at Ralph, who promptly turned his back. He did not care to be stared at in his misery, but it was no use. The women moved around to the other side of the glass. Isn't he darling? Asked Betty. Just look at his cunning little paws. Mary Lou leaned closer for a better look. And his little ears, aren't they sweet? Betty was delighted. It was disgusting. It was bad enough to be trapped and stared at, but to have this pair carry on in such a gushy fashion was almost more than Ralph could stomach. Cunning little paws indeed. They were strong paws, paws for grasping the hand grips of a motorcycle. Oh, Betty, do you suppose we could take him back to Wichita with us? Asked Mary Lou. My third grade would love him. So would my kindergarten, agreed Betty. We could keep him in a cage on the ledge, and all the children could bring him food from home. It would be such a good experience for them to have a pet in the classroom. Well, thought Ralph grimly, I always wanted to travel. A cage in a kindergarten in Wichita, however, was not exactly the destination that he had in mind. The minutes were slipping by dangerously fast. He had to do something. Look, he shouted through the glass in desperation. Let me go. Please let me go. There's something terrible important I've got to do. He squeaked, marveled Betty. He's adorable, squealed Mary Lou. It was no use. Young women could not speak his language. Ralph was in despair. He thought of Keith tossing feverishly in bed and of his family huddled in the mouse nest waiting for a safe return. But I don't see how we could take him back to Wichita, said Betty sensibly. We're driving to San Francisco and then to Disneyland before we start back. How could we carry him thousands of miles? The two teachers looked thoughtfully at Ralph, who knew his fate depended on their decision. Was he to be carried to Disneyland and eventually to the ledge in a kindergarten room in Wichita? Or would they let him go? A third possibility crossed Ralph's mind. Perhaps they would leave him under the glass for the housekeepers to see. He hoped not. He did not think that he could last that long. Already the inside of the glass was beginning to feel warm and airless. I suppose we really shouldn't turn him loose in the hotel, said Mary Lou. Mice are pests, even if they are cute. The teacher not only destroyed Ralph's hopes, she hurt his feelings as well, calling him a pest when he was just on an errand of mercy. From the mouse's point of view, the teachers were the pests. I know, exclaimed Betty suddenly, causing Ralph to look over his shoulder for a clue to what she knew. I know how we can get rid of him without hurting him. The young teacher reached over to the bedside table where she picked up a picture postcard. She slid it carefully under the glass and under Ralph's feet so that he was now standing on a postcard. He noticed the picture was of a giant redwood tree, the same postcard all travelers bought when they came to California. Now what are you going to do? Asked Mary Lou. Watch. Betty carefully lifted the postcard, Ralph and the glass, and walked across the room. Even though he knew it was useless, Ralph scrambled around in his tiny prison. He was afraid she was taking him towards the wash basin. He had heard of mice being drowned by people who did not like traps. The teacher walked not to the wash basin, but to the open window. She held Ralph across the sill, removed the postcard from the glass, and gave it a little jerk that shook Ralph off into the vines that grew up the side of the building. There, she said, and closed the window, leaving Ralph clinging to a vine high above the ground. Dun, dun, dun. And look what's next. An errand of mercy. We will have to find out whether that owl gets Ralph tomorrow and if Keith is going to come out okay. See you tomorrow.